Hi, everybody. JenTalks here again, and this is part two of a talk on grief. And I suppose just to add, I was taken aback by all of the amazing feedback I had last week when I did part one. It wasn't intended to be a part one, it was just intended to be a standalone talk on grief. And I had such an overwhelming response from people who contacted me privately to say, what a difference it made to them, just those little words of wisdom that I had last week. And like I said last week, I am not by any means an expert on grief or any of these topics. I'm relating to my own learning and education and also my own personal experience. So I suppose in the short space of time I have to give a Gen talk every week, I can only kind of zone in on little elements that I wish to speak about. So when I was asked to do part two, particularly I was asked to look at grief, which is not necessarily related to the loss of an individual or loss of life. It's around the idea that we grieve also the end of relationships, we grieve the end of a job, we also grieve maybe the possibilities or the future that we may have seen in different contexts. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I want to start by saying, again, even though I said it last week, that grief is as individual as your fingerprint. But the one thing that we all share in common when it comes to grief is the need for our grief to be seen. And what we mean by that is that we try not to silver line people's pain when it comes to grief, that we acknowledge their grief, that it's visible, that it's seen, heard, and held. And you've probably heard me use that expression a few times around different concepts. The idea that our basic human need is to be seen, really seen, heard for what we're saying, and held. And what we mean by held is held in respect, in a safe place, or also even held from the point of view of actually somebody holding you, giving you a hug, holding your hand. And grief is no different. So when we talk about grief, regardless of whether we're talking about the loss of life or we're talking about the loss of something like a time in our life, an opportunity, a relationship, a job, a period in life that we thought was going to be different. We talk about the three areas of loss. So the first one is actually the loss itself, that we pine for what it is that we've lost, and we really go into a kind of a sadness, and even sometimes it's associated with a depression, but it's overwhelming. It's something that we cannot think about except for this loss. And then longing is another element of grief, where we long for things to be the same. So we long for the person that we've lost to still be with us. We long for the situation that we're in to remain the same or to return to what it was, or we long for that relationship to continue or to restart. And then the next one then is the feeling of being lost. So we're lost without our loved one that we've just lost. Our life doesn't seem like it can go on in the same way, or we're lost heading out into the world without that relationship or without that job or without that identity or without that piece of ourselves that we might have lost along the way. So it's about seeing those elements in all of our grief, because it's something that we have in common. It's something that every single human will experience on this planet at some point, that we're all going to have the experience of grief in common. So when we notice that somebody is grieving and we want to, I suppose, support them, it's great for us to understand, even if you've never experienced grief yet, to understand that there is those elements of it. And they're not in any particular order. Loss, longing, and feeling lost are a huge part of grief. And then what we talk about is different types of grief. So we have the acute grief that we feel just when we lose somebody, the instant feeling of sadness, of longing, of lost, of feeling lost. Anxiety is often coupled with it, extreme tiredness. I mean, people would say about grief that it's a form of madness, and anyone that's experienced extreme acute grief will know that you do have that feeling of like losing your mind, like big things just fall out of your head that you would never expect to forget. Like you might forget to collect your kids from school, or forget that it's somebody's birthday, or even forget your own birthday. I mean, huge things that would never fall out of your head might fall out of your head. So it feels a little bit like you're losing your mind. And that's why we would say that up to 2 years in a grieving period, and again, everybody's different, but 1 to 2 years, we shouldn't really make big, huge life-changing decisions because our mind is a little bit frazzled and not operating at its best self. Of course, you are the expert of you, as I always say. So you know that better than anybody when is the best time for you to make a decision, but that's what experts say. The other part of grief then is what we call integrated grief. So integrated grief is where you start to embed grief into your life. You start to get on with your life. And it's not that we ever get over grief. It's the idea that grief finds somewhere to live within us. It finds a place to live. And I talked about that last week, about having a place to honor grief in your life, that grief will walk alongside you in your life. It doesn't always have to feel like acute grief. It might pop its acute head up and every now and again, and it might overwhelm you. But for the most part, it becomes part of our everyday lived experience. And we honor our grief. We find a way to honor. So it might be by talking to the person. Depending on your own rituals and your cultures, you'll find a way to honor your grief. I know for me, my way when I was first dealing with grief and trying to integrate it into my life, getting beyond the acute stage, was I felt honoring my mother's memory was by living my life in the best way that I possibly could. So that was my way of honoring grief. It didn't disappear. The longing and the loss didn't disappear, but I learned to live with it alongside me. And then we have what I mentioned last week for a little couple of moments is complicated grief. Complicated grief is where grief it stays in that acute stage for whatever reason. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that the actual cause of loss was complicated. So complicated grief can also be related to the ending of a relationship, job, or time in your life. But it's usually much more associated with the loss of an individual or loss of a loved one. And the nature of the death doesn't necessarily make it a complicated grief, although it can. But what it is that we just can't get over the acute grief, and we stay trapped in that feeling of major loss, anxiety, longing, and lostness that doesn't evolve into integrated grief. And if you recognize that in yourself, we just to really bring it home to say that kind of grief, complicated grief, needs to be treated or at least supported by a health professional, particularly somebody who has experience with complicated grief. And then the last kind of type of grief that's not that commonly known is what we call disenfranchised grief. And what that means is that's grief that hasn't been given the correct regard or respect that grief would normally be given. So what we mean by that is maybe we didn't have the same mourning or rituals or cultural acknowledgements that we would have when it comes to grief. And this is very much associated with when somebody loses maybe a home, loses a job, loses a relationship. Sometimes it can be to do with your own personality. If something happens in a relationship where you might lose your confidence, survivors of abuse often suffer from disenfranchised abuse grief because of elements of themselves that they had to give up or they had to lose. Disenfranchised grief is also associated with the loss of a loved one, particularly if the loss of a loved one was somebody that wasn't known to everybody else in your family. Maybe the enormity of that grief isn't recognized or supported or respected even. So you're expected to maybe either grieve alone or not grieve at all. You're grieved, maybe if you loved somebody that you shouldn't have loved in the eyes of other people, that's often where we would see a case of disenfranchised grief. And again, disenfranchised grief, alongside all of the others, has the same needs and wants as all of the other griefs. It's to be seen, heard, and held. And that when we see people grieving or we experience grieving ourselves, that we honor it and we respect it. And how we honor and respect it is by our own individual rituals. It's not to say that what works for you will work for me or vice versa. It's to find your way to honor and respect the memory of that person and to have your rituals that you can process grief. And of course, in all of that, it comes back to you tuning in, slowing down, pausing, and being aware of what is needed for you right now, and also delivering on that. So minding yourself, being kind to yourself, understanding that you don't need to drive yourself forward in this time where you're grieving. Maybe the kindest thing to do is to take some time off work, is to go and socialize with friends, is to go and have a lie down. You know, everybody has their own kind of things that they do to help themselves feel better, but just to acknowledge it in yourself or other people and to honor and respect it. So I know it's not the most gorgeous or happiest of topics to talk about, but based on the feedback I got last week, it's definitely something that's important to talk about, because that's one of the things that we tend to do with topics that don't seem to be so pleasant, is we push them down. We won't talk about them. We won't mention that, you know, somebody's mom has died or their dog has died or they've lost their job or their relationship has ended. And actually, sometimes people just need to know that you see them in their pain and you support them in their pain. So if you can do that for yourself or others, then you can certainly find a way to honor grief. So I hope that talk was helpful. I look forward to being back here next week, and I will be talking about empathy next week, as I said I would this week, until I was asked to do the part 2. So if you're tuning in to JenTalks, you can catch it on my YouTube channel live every week, and it's also posted across my social media platforms. So whatever platform you're on, there'll be somewhere for you to come across the talk, and I hope you enjoyed it. Please like the clip and post a comment if you feel free to do so, or ask a question. I certainly get back to you. And if you like what I do, spread the word. Thanks very much for today, guys. I'll see you all back here next